you all, and welcome back to Living Unveiled with Maddie. Today, I want to talk about something personal. And honestly, I think it is important because sometimes mature believers become so focused on functioning outwardly that we stop paying attention to what is quietly happening internally. Recently, I went through a sequence of events that affected me more deeply than I had initially realized. My mom had passed away suddenly, no warning, but quietly. After her Bible reading and quiet time with God, she went into her room, laid down and slept, and that was it. Peaceful transition, but a huge loss and blow. And before I had even fully processed that grief, another sudden loss followed. My cousin, healthy, vibrant, full of life and conviction, also passed suddenly. And shortly after that came another devastating incident. My husband's very good friend fell from the top of a staircase, ended up in the ER, and by God's mercy woke up after 6 days. Now, outwardly life continued. Responsibilities still existed, people still needed things. I was still showing up for the podcast, I was still recording, and I was just trying to remain present. Though if I'm honest, the pace had started slowing down, and it was painstaking at times. But internally, something had started changing quietly. And I did not initially recognize how deeply those repeated shocks were affecting my thoughts life. I felt myself plunging into an abyss of grief I had never known. And what unsettled me most was not merely the grief itself. It was realizing how quietly my thoughts had started changing underneath it all. Because after witnessing repeated loss and instability within a short period of time, one thought entered my mind almost unnoticed. What if something happens again? And honestly, I did not challenge it initially because it did not sound irrational. It sounded careful, aware, and responsible. But the problem with certain thoughts is that once they are entertained repeatedly, they do not remain isolated. They start connecting themselves to other thoughts. And before long, I noticed my mind spiraling into loops. One thought leading into another, then another, and then another. What if someone dies in their sleep? What if another call with the bad news comes unexpectedly? What if I close my eyes and something happens to me too? What if life is no longer as stable as I thought it was? And the frightening thing about loops is that they begin feeding themselves. The mind starts scanning for confirmation, replaying scenarios, rehearsing possibilities, anticipating darkness before anything has even happened. And once that cycle continues long enough, the body eventually joins the conversation. That was what started happening to me. My mind stopped resting properly. Even when nothing was happening externally, internally, something remained active. I was scanning, I was watching, I was anticipating. And eventually, my body started responding to what my mind had been rehearsing repeatedly. My blood pressure rose, palpitations started, sleep became disrupted. Even my natural habitat, which is silence, started feeling a little too loud. And that unsettled me deeply because silence had always been the place where I prayed, reflected, processed, and recalibrated internally. But suddenly, stillness no longer felt peaceful. It felt exposing. As though my nervous system had become so conditioned to anticipating disturbance that even quietness no longer knew how to settle me. I think this is the part of what makes strongholds so dangerous, not merely because they affect our behavior, but because they quietly begin altering perception, expectation, emotional regulation, and internal atmosphere long before a person fully realizes what is happening. I think many believers misunderstand how strongholds actually begin, because when people hear the word stronghold, they often imagine only obvious bondage like addiction, immorality, visible destruction. But Scripture reveals something much deeper than that. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, 4-5 says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they are mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ." Now notice where Paul places the battle. Imaginations, thoughts, mental exaltations. That means strongholds are not merely external. Many begin internally through repeated thought patterns and reinforced agreements. A thought remains too long. A fear becomes repeatedly rehearsed. A painful experience quietly changes how a person interprets life. And over time, the thought becomes a pattern, and then the pattern turns into an agreement, and then the agreement becomes a lens, and eventually the lens becomes a stronghold. And that's why strongholds are dangerous, not merely because of behavior, but because of perception. A stronghold is not simply a sinful habit. Many times it is a fortified way of seeing things, a thought system that has become established enough to influence how a person interprets reality itself. This is why two people can go through similar experiences and emerge completely differently internally. One becomes softer, another becomes fearful, another becomes guarded, and another becomes very bitter. Another quietly begins expecting darkness even before it arrives. Because experiences alone do not shape people, internal agreements do. And the frightening thing about strongholds is that they rarely announce themselves as bondage initially. Many arrive sounding wise, careful, protective, reasonable. And that was exactly what was happening to me. Because after those repeated incidents, my mind slowly shifted from processing grief to anticipating danger. And once anticipation enters the mind repeatedly, the nervous system begins responding as though the danger is already present. Modern research consistently shows that prolonged stress, unresolved grief, chronic anxiety, and repeated mental distress can contribute to hypertension, weakened immunity, insomnia, anxiety disorders, depression, inflammation, and nervous system deregulation. Scripture actually revealed this connection long before psychology began studying it deeply. Proverbs 12:25 says, "Heaviness in the heart of a man makes it stoop." Proverbs 17:22 says, "A broken spirit dries the bone." And David said in Psalm 32, "When I kept silence, my bones waxed old through my roaring all the day long." Notice the language: internal torment, physical deterioration. Even Elijah, after calling down fire from heaven, eventually collapsed emotionally under the juniper tree and asked God to let him die. Great spiritual victory externally, deep exaltation internally. Because being spiritual does not suddenly remove a person from human reality while living on earth. I think mature believers especially need to become more honest about this, because many of us have learned how to function while slowly deteriorating internally. We know how to preach while exhausted, serve while depleted, lead while anxious, and smile while mentally drowning. And sometimes we become so committed to appearing spiritually stable that we stop paying attention to what is happening within us. But refusing to acknowledge human reality does not produce maturity. It produces performance. And I refuse to become a spook. Yes, I know I am called the Son of God. Yes, I know I have assignments, purpose, and responsibility. Yes, I know I am spirit possessing a soul, and I'm living in a body. But while I'm here, I still do experience grief. I still become tired. I still have moments where I need strengthening. And Scripture never presents isolation as maturity. 1 Corinthians 12 says, "The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of it." We exist through supply. through strengthening, through fellowship, through interaction. That is not weakness. That is design, intentional design. And I think many mature believers quietly suffer longer than necessary because they mistake isolation for strength. But maturity is not pretending pressure does not exist. Maturity is remaining aligned with truth while being honest about what is happening internally. And eventually, I realized I could not continue sitting alone inside that internal loop. So I reached out to a friend, not dramatically, but honestly, because I could tell my thoughts were no longer settling properly on their own. And it reminded me of something I shared in episode 68 about binary star systems, that stars do not function entirely in isolation. There is interaction, exchange, redistribution, and human beings are not designed for prolonged emotional isolation either. Without healthy interaction, grief, fear, pressure, and emotional exhaustion can continue recycling internally, and that was where I was. So when I reached out, I was not looking for noise. I needed interruption. I needed perspective, grounding. And guess what? She stayed, she listened, she prayed, she laughed, she joked, she spoke truth gently. And slowly, something started settling internally again. The loop broke. Clarity returned. Peace slowly started returning. It wasn't instant. Rather, it was gradual. Because sometimes healing is not dramatic. Sometimes healing is the slow restoration of internal stability, the return of stillness, the return of proper alignment internally. And I think this matters deeply because not every stronghold announces itself loudly. Some settle quietly through repeated internal agreements. And if those agreements are not interrupted, they slowly begin reorganizing perception, expectation, emotion, and behavior around themselves. But this is also the hope. The mind can be renewed, patterns can be interrupted, and peace can return. Because Romans 12 verse 2 says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Isaiah 26 verse 3 says, thou will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee. Stayed, not drifting, spiraling, endlessly rehearsing fear, but stayed. And maybe that is the question I want to leave with mature believers today. Not simply, what am I doing outwardly, but what has been quietly occupying my inner world? What thoughts have I normalized? What fears have I repeatedly rehearsed? Or what internal agreements have I stopped challenging simply because they sound reasonable now? Because strongholds, like I said earlier, rarely begin loudly. Most begin subtly, quietly, and internally. And if we are spiritually mature enough to discern demons around us, we should also be mature enough to discern unhealthy agreements forming within us. So before this week ends, sit honestly with God. Pay attention to your internal conversations. Pay attention to the loops. Pay attention to the thoughts you keep rehearsing in private. And ask yourself, what has this been producing within me? Because eventually, whatever occupies the inner life long enough begins expressing itself outwardly. Until next time, stay unveiled.